There are moments in every person's life when they face intense adversity. They're crucibles that forge who they become as individuals and as leaders. Now more than ever, we need leaders who are called to a higher standard, focused on leaving it better than they found it, and paying it forward to the next generations. Now, let's join Fire Chief Randy Brugman as he speaks with leaders from all walks of life, as he explores and learns from their personal journeys and the crucibles that have forged them into better leaders and better people.
Chief Merkison was born and raised in Clayton County, where his family has made their home for over 50 years. After graduating from North Clayton High School, Chief Merkison attended and graduated from Griffin Technical Institute, where he majored in architectural engineering and drafting. He furthered his education at Columbia Southern University, where he graduated Summa Cum Laude with a bachelor's degree in fire administration and a master's degree in business. Chief Merkison began his firefighting career as a volunteer with the City of Jonesboro in 1992, and in 1993 he was hired by the City of Riverdale, and in March 1996 he began his career with Clayton County Fire and Emergency Services. He was promoted through the ranks, serving as Sergeant Lieutenant Captain within the Fire Marshal's office, and in 2008 was promoted to Battalion Chief, charged with creating the Technical Services Division. From 2010 to 2013, he served as a member of the Fire Chief's executive staff as the Assistant Chief Deputy and Deputy Director of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. On November 5, 2013, he was appointed the 6th Fire Chief of Clayton County Fire and Emergency Services, where he also serves as EMS Director and Director of Emergency Management. And in January of 2021, Chief Merkison was appointed to head the new Office of Resilience and Sustainability. In addition to his roles with the department, Chief Merkison serves as a chairman of Clayton County Fire and Emergency Services Citizen Corps Council and as a member of Region 3 EMS Council. In October of 2014, the Board of Commissioners appointed him to serve on the Board of Directors for Southern Regional Medical Center. And in 2020, Governor Brian Kemp appointed him to serve on the Georgia Firefighter Standards and Training Council. Well, welcome, Chief. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to get to see you again, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to start off with is your title recently changed a year or so ago from Fire Chief to Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Fire and Emergency Services. So what was the importance of that change?
So I think that the importance of that change is it represents kind of a shift in strategy from the Board of Commissioners and how we look at the community and the services we provide. So, as we continue to shift as an industry, as fire and emergency services, we deal so much more now with the environmental side. You see kind of a shift across the country with a lot of emergency management agencies being folded up underneath fire, and emergency medical, just because there's such a natural, symbiotic relationship between what we do as fire and EMS providers and the world of emergency management. So, probably 10, 15 years ago that the county made that shift and brought emergency management up underneath the fire department. So, I also serve as the emergency management director. But as we start looking at resilience and what does that mean for our community, we play such a large role in how our communities function and the ability for our communities to continue to function in the face of disaster, whatever that may be, whether that's man-made, whether that's natural, whether it's, biological, chemical, whatever it may be. So, we started looking at a lot of our programming and said, hey, from the emergency management side of the house and being proactive and planning, we need to start looking at our policies. We need to start looking at our procedures and our practices from a resilience lens. So much of what FEMA looks at now through its community lifeline model is aimed at building resilient communities. So as we look at that from a strategy standpoint for where is fire and EMS going in the future, what does, the 21st century fire and EMS look like? What does that mean for our communities as we continue to find ways to serve them? It became important that we prepare this community to be resilient in the face of that and not just be that reactive response organization that deals with the issue and then goes back to doing what we were doing. How do we prepare them to be able to function during a disaster? If you have something that's going to be long term, you can't have disruption in services. And we need to plan for that. We need to be methodical about what we do. We need to be very intentional about our actions and our policies and the things that we do. So, the board took a look at that, and myself and my chief operating officer sat down and, we looked at our accreditation goals and our models and our strategic plan. And we really started to see a lot of alignment between what we were doing as an organization and what the Board of Commissioners was trying to do. And it really flowed nicely into many of the resiliency models that you see. And you see so many offices of resilience popping up in communities. The Rockefeller Center has their 100 resilient communities, or that's out there. So following that model, we presented to the board and said, hey, let's merge these two entities, and let's merge the strategic plans that they're working on and really work to building a resilient Clayton County. So, the decision was made to restructure my position once again, and make me the Chief Resiliency Officer and Director of Fire and Emergency Services. So we're really now looking at the services we provide from a global perspective instead of just that respond to the alarm we're given.
Yeah, and it kind of plays right into the 21st Century Fire and Emergency Services report that I had the opportunity to work on, but I know that you've taken that and rolled that into your strategic planning process, not only for the department, but for the county as well.
Yeah, that became I got introduced to that document, through our conversations. And I'm so grateful for that, because when you look at what that document lays out, it hits so many of the issues that the fire service is facing, and quite frankly has faced. We just haven't had the conversation about it, right? It hasn't been brought to the forefront. We've all, as leaders, we've been kind of suffering in silence and in a silo with trying to figure out, how do I get past this in my organization? How do I apply these principles? And, we were in this thought pattern that I'm the only one that's dealing with this issue. And then you go read this white paper and you're like, wow, this is, all these other folk are having the same issues I'm having. So let's figure out a way to move the industry through it. And if you're open and honest with yourself about where you are as a leader, where your organization is, in its service to its community, then you'll start to see just how many of those critical issues you may be facing now, you may have already addressed, and you may be able to offer something, to other organizations. That's why I love this platform. And you think about the leadership crucible and what does that mean? As leaders, we all go through this kind of obstacle course, right? And the goal is to get to where we can kind of be on autopilot, and our organization is just running smooth, and that's the vision, and that's the hallmark version. We know that's not going to happen, in our industry, but, recognizing where our industry is and the issues that face us, I think is key. And, the accreditation model, through CFAI, forces you to look at a lot of these things, and you got to be willing to accept what comes out of that. But applying that 21st century white paper, it just fell in lockstep with the strategic plan that we had created through the accreditation process. And then when we took those two documents and went back and looked at what the Board of Commissioners was doing locally and what their vision was, so much of it aligned as well. So it became very easy to take all three of those documents and then kind of set the future for Clayton County Fire and Emergency Services for the next 5 years and say, look, this is how we're going to address these critical issues. This is how we're going to address them from a resilience lens and make sure that not only our community, but this organization is resilient, right? How does the organization continue to move forward and provide the services that we are demanded to provide, understanding that the issues that everybody's facing, staffing, being able to make sure we have enough people to provide those services, training, paramedic shortages, just people that are leaving the industry because of burnout. How do we address call volume, that's going up 7.5% to 8% a year? It's outpacing, call volume and inflation seem to be running kind of hand in hand right now. So, you can throw a 5%, merit increase or a 5% thing, but that's going to get eaten up, as soon as it's put out there. So all of these things, work into that resiliency lens and trying to figure out how do we continue to do what our citizens expect us to do? And from a leadership standpoint, how do we communicate that message to our people?
Yeah. Well, experience is the best teacher, but we have to share it with others. I appreciate,
Absolutely.
I appreciate you bringing that up earlier. I also think that as I've heard from several other professionals in other type of organizations, that the 21st Century Report, those 8 critical issues actually play into their professions as well. So I think that's what you found with your county board as they looked at it as well. So I think that's a testament to, I guess, what we had come up with at the time. So,
yeah, no, you're 100% correct. That document, you could just take, the 21st Century Fire Service and just white out the fire service and just put a blank. Is that the 21st century retail? Is that 21st century hospitality? Is it 21st? Fill in the blank. Transportation. The airline industry could take that document, and learn from it. Any sector out there can take it and learn from it. Because as you said, I mean, the critical issues in there are nothing that is specific to the fire service. It's about managing people, and it's about managing environments, and it's about being able to sit down and be open and honest and have conversations that, as an industry, we've avoided for a long time. And it's starting to rear its ugly head right now. So the sooner that we as leadership in an industry embrace those types of conversations and embrace that thought pattern, a lot better off our industry will be.
Yeah. Well, and one of the critical issues is sustainability, and I think it's kind of the foundational piece of any organization is to be sustainable long term. And I think if we don't have those conversations, those courageous conversations, and actually develop game plans to address each one of those issues, then we won't be here. In 20, 25 years. It's just not going to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the future of our industry is in our hands. And, it's, you got to start looking at, a lot of times in government services, you lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, it's a business. We're in the, our customer base is our citizens. And, a lot of the things we do are based in saving lives and property. But at the end of the day, we have a fiduciary responsibility to them as well. And in order to do what we need to do, we got to have the people to do it. But we got to take care of them, and we got to understand the stack effect that this profession has. We have to recognize that the workforce of today was not trained and equipped the way we were when we came into this business, 25, 30 years ago. It's a different animal. The fire service is not what it was 25 or 30 years ago. It's not what it was 10 years ago.
No, it's changed dramatically, hasn't it?
It has. And I think the 21st Century White Paper, it just puts you in a mindset that you need to assess your organization repetitively, constantly, continually. We can't say, okay, well, we had that conversation. We'll come back to it in 5 years. Or we'll address it the next time it comes up, because so much of where we find ourselves is because of that, right? We're so used to being reactionary in what our primary responsibilities are that we lose sight of the fact that 10 years goes by and we're still having the same conversations.
Yeah, and haven't addressed the problems.
Do we stop the insanity, right?
Yeah, very, very true. And we're not the only profession that does that. I mean, they get
not my long shot.
No, I mean, you get caught up in your bureaucracy, and your viewpoint is where you sit in the organization. It's not from a customer standpoint, and I think that's the real shift that's going on, is that we have to look at things through the customer's eyes and not our own.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the interesting part when you go through strategic planning and you go through accreditation is when you start. I think we all have the thought of what we think our citizen base expectations are, and what they view our strengths and what do they view our weaknesses to be. But if you're bold enough to go and panel a section of them and ask them, you may find out you're on the wrong track, and you may find out that some of your assumptions are not accurate. So a lot of the planning that you've been doing may be in contradiction to what your community expects. So, and that's a shift, for a lot of agencies and a lot of just, well, we're the experts, we're going to provide it this way. Well, you need to understand what your community's expectations are. and make sure that you're meeting those needs. And the only way you're going to do that is to go ask them. But you got to be willing. If you're going to ask the question, you got to be willing to accept the response. And there's some education that goes in with that, right? I mean, there's some unrealistic expectations out there. But once again, that's part of the conversation, right? So that the whole thought process is not to come up with a who's right, who's wrong, this is what it should be. It's an open conversation about expectations, because we know that our citizens, play a big role in that too. When to call 911, when to not. So there's constant, issues and impediments on both sides of the service delivery, model. But it all starts with that open communication. So when I go and I address my board of commissioners, and I'm going because I need X, whatever it is, hey, I need another $1 million. I need this. I need all this equipment. And they're like, well, why do you need us to spend this kind of money? Because it's what our citizens expect. Here's what they've told me they expect out of this organization. So if they're expecting it of me as a department head, you can translate those expectations to you as their elected leadership. So if I'm asking and it's not getting there, then at least I fulfilled their expectations. But it all starts with that open conversation. You just got to be willing to ask, but understand it. When we first went through the first accreditation cycle, that 90th percentile gets you every time. You don't look near like the rock star you thought you were, when you're running averages, but that's what you do 90% of the time. It's reality. And that's so much of the 21st century white paper is dealing in reality and not what our assumptions have been over the years about where our industry is. We got to go ask. When we started a lot of our programming, that's what it was driven for, was just asking the questions of our people, but then being willing to accept it, but then more importantly, ready to act on it.
Yeah. I think we've moved, from we're going to tell you what we're going to do for you, and become much more customer centric. And I think that's driven different deployment models and strategies, and we're seeing it like in your organization, but it's starting to expand out throughout the profession, and we're seeing that in the private sector as well. I mean, they're doing business differently than they were 10 years ago, because if they don't, they're not here.
Right,
and the same
they become irrelevant.
Yeah,
and
same will be true for us in this profession if we continue down that road. Let me shift gears a little bit. I know you've been, a chief for 10 years now. Been in the service for.
Yeah, I'm on my 10th year now.
Been in the service for 25, 28 years.
28.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You've probably faced some pretty significant issues as you have traveled that journey. But could you just share, maybe one or two that really have impacted who you've become as a leader and maybe even as a person? Yeah,
absolutely. I think for me, I take it all the way back to the selection process, right? For chief, when I was up for chief. And, as anybody that's been in this business long enough knows, when there's transition in leadership, those processes have a tendency to go sideways, relatively quickly, especially when politics gets brought into it. But, there was a lot of transitional things going on in the county at that time. And, the selection of the next fire chief kind of got caught up in some of that. So it was a difficult process, right? It was one that it taught me a lot of, I learned a long time ago, sometimes you got to be cautious about what you ask the good Lord for, right? Because if I've learned anything over my 50 years on this planet, is he's got a sense of humor, right? And how he does things and how he manipulates things. And sometimes, when you ask for patience, you don't get patience, right? You get situations which affords you the opportunity to be patient. And whether or not you take advantage of that is on you, right? You got what you asked for. So when I decided to throw my hat in the ring for chief, I was assistant chief of emergency services, which I got to tell you is not a bad gig to have. You're number 2 in the organization. So, you get the opportunity to affect some policy, make some decisions, but ultimately you're not responsible, for the organization and where it's headed. So it's a good pocket to be in. But, when you make the decision to to go for chief or apply for chief or however it works in your local municipality, you got to ask yourself ultimately, why are you doing it? And what is the outcome for it? Because you know the demands, right? Because you can watch other chiefs, you learn from other chiefs, and you can kind of see the toll that position is going to take on you as an individual. But for me, it came down to, was I willing to accept whatever happened to the organization moving forward? Right. So understanding the goals and objectives that had been put into place and the things that we were working towards, for me, it became down to, if that doesn't continue down that course, or some of the excellent programming we had put into place came about, if that didn't continue, was I okay working in a structure for the next 10 to 15 years of my career in which we completely shifted gears? And for me, that was not acceptable. So, I jumped into the foray, so to speak, for chief. And it was just a process that became extra politicized for things outside of my control. And I was not the primary focus, but as they say, got caught in the jet wash. Right. So as my predecessor used to say all the time, the only people that suffer when the bulls fight in the swamp are the frogs. So I became a frog. Right. But it taught me a lot that, that there was a process that we went through that at the end of the day, obviously I was selected as chief, and here we are. But it taught me a lot about who I am and what I'm able to withstand. Right. And it taught me a lot about how much faith can play into the success of an organization and the success of you as a leader, and understanding how not to compromise who you are as an individual, in the carrying out of your duties as chief. But I think for me, that whole experience, it drove me to become so much more focused on our people. And I knew coming in as chief, our people had to be the focus of everything that we do. I have to put, their careers, their livelihoods, their families at the top of that list, and make sure that from a policymaker, from, things that we do as an organization, the way we expand our programming is all focused on making sure that it has their careers at heart, and that I'm setting them up to be successful. Right. So often it's easy to sit back as a chief and say, well, it's going to be my way or the highway, because now I'm chief. And, if you don't like it, then one day make chief and do it your own way. That's certainly one way to go about it. It's not going to win you a lot of popularity contests with your folk. And, as we've learned more and we've started having these open conversations with our people, we understand just how much of a two-way partnership this is. I think once, you make the commitment as an organization to jump out there and have the conversations, you'll really be surprised with the feedback that you could get and how willing your people are to open up. They want the conversation. They want to have it. They just want to know that they're not going to be fired for having it. Or that there's not going to be some sort of, retaliation for saying, hey, I'm struggling with this. I go up and I speak with them at their peer sessions, just to say, hey, guys, y'all aren't the only ones. The struggle of this profession is real at all levels. It's just what may be adding to the stressors is slightly different. But the struggle is real. We get it. Everybody's in. You got to be willing to sit down and have an open conversation and be willing to help each other. And once once your people start to realize that you're really there for them, then it really starts to break down a lot of the traditional barriers that we've seen in our industry over the years, and can really start to make a massive difference.
Yeah. Well, I think you pointed out very effectively that as you move up through the organization and you have different experiences that help to shape you, your lens, your viewpoint changes. And you don't know what you don't know until you're sitting in the seat, and that's true not only for a fire chief, but if you're running your own company or a CEO of a large organization, you've aspired to move up through the ranks, however that process works in the profession you're in. But once you're in the chair, the view can be quite different than you thought it was going to be.
You're so right. And you always, coming up, you always hear people say, oh, well, I got called to the corner office. And I tell my people it's a corner for a reason. And it's because there's nobody else to the right of me. So there's not a more stark realization that the buck stops with you to realize that there's not another office to my right or behind me. So, you're so right, whether you just got promoted to CEO or you got promoted to this. We've always heard you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. And when you realize that you're now responsible, in my case, for the lives of 422 employees, that's sobering. You're also responsible to answer for their actions. So, and that can be sobering on many occasions, as you well know, as an agency head, when you have to answer for those things, right? So there's nothing, and I tell my young ones the same thing, it's so that this profession has so many ironies that's just baked into who it is, that it's almost laughable. But, as a chief, what you said, you don't know what you don't know. And I tell my day one employees the same thing. You can't know whether or not you can do this job until you do it. I said, this is not something you can look at a flyer and say, yeah, I can do that. You don't know because you never experienced it. So that's why I told my staff, I quit asking in interviews a long time ago, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I quit asking the question. They're like, why don't you ask? I said, because I can't guarantee they're going to make it past the next 18 months. I said, let's get them through probation and get them certified. Then we'll worry about what they're going to do for the next 5 years. I said, we need to be worried about how are they going to negotiate this training? Do they even know what they don't know yet? They don't know what this job's about. They don't know the demands. They've never felt it. And it's one of those things that you have to experience it. Until you take somebody's vision away from them and see how they react in situations, till you put them in environments that just aren't natural. You restrict their movement. You put them, where in positions where they feel you don't know what people are going to do and how they're going to react. So I said it's really kind of a disingenuous question just to ask for the sake of asking. At that point, I'm concerned, what are you going to do in the next 12? What are you going to do in the next 18? What are you going to do the first time you step out on a fatality? How are you going to react to that? Do you understand what's available to you to help you deal with that? So it's, and you can ask the same thing of a brand new chief. I never will forget my administrative assistant who just retired, my office manager. She's been with me for the 9 years I've been chief. She was, she served 3 fire chiefs here. So I've been with her for the vast majority of my executive career. And, the first day I made chief, I was appointed on a Tuesday night, November 13th. I walked in on Wednesday morning, the next morning, and she walked in my office and said, well, now what? She said, you got what you wanted. Now what? And that hits you, right? Right. And so I just looked at her. I said, well, what should be, what do I do first? It's you've prepared yourself for that moment. Right. And then you come in and, as you said, you sit down in the chair, you're behind the big desk, that's been sitting there that, you've probably been on the other side of at some point in your career. But now you're sitting behind it. So now what? What now? And then you realize everybody's looking to you. Right. All right, boss. Right. So now that's when the gravity hits, right? That's when the levity of the situation hits, and that's when you start to feel the weight of sitting in the chair and having the ultimate responsibility. So as leaders, now what? Right? And that's something that there's no book out there that says, congratulations, you made chief. Here's what you do day one. Right? Because that's going to be different throughout the organization. What do you need to do? What's going to be the first thing? And as my predecessors told me, trust me, something will be brought to you within the first week that you're chief that you got to deal with. So the work will come to you, but you got to be prepared to deal with it and handle it. And you got to make sure that your organization feels your leadership, right? That they're just not going to be wandering around in the wilderness, so to speak. But that's a sobering thought. And I would imagine it's like that no matter what industry or profession you're in. You make CEO and somebody's going to look at you and say, all right, now what?
Yeah. No, I've talked to a lot of professionals in other organizations that run large companies, and there's a common theme that after you get that job, in the first week you'll have multiple visits from employees telling you about a great idea or what's wrong with the organization. And one of the things that I found, because I moved around in several organizations, is don't discount all of those conversations. Because there may be some nuggets of clarity in people coming to you and saying, have you thought about this, or will you think about this? And then there's others that are just trying to stir the pot.
Yeah, absolutely. So discernment, right? Another task they don't teach you in the How to Be a Chief book, right? So is trying to figure out who's straight, who's shooting straight with you, who has an ulterior motive, who's trying to help you, or who's trying to help themselves, or is it none of the above, right? So it becomes difficult to try and weed through all that, and that's but I think that's where you go back and you lean on your training, coming up through the ranks, and if you just learn how to apply what you've learned at 20 plus years, in the industry when you ascend the leadership ladder, then it's all applicable, right? The things I learned in recruit class, I can pull from and I can leverage them as a chief. The things I learned as a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, a battalion chief, they're all applicable to what we do. So if you take all of those lessons that you've learned, coming up through the ranks in your organization, or, whether you've gone into another organization or whatever the case may be, is just lean on that history, lean on those lessons, but understand it's also going to start with those conversations, right? Like you're saying, I had a line of folk out my door day one as well. You can't shut them down. You got to have the conversation. But it's what you do with that conversation, and is what you're able to weed through. And those are the challenges, right? And that's kind of a skill set that you gotta develop your own style, right? You gotta figure out, how am I going to work through this? How am I going to learn who I can rely on? And they'll show themselves, right? There's one thing I've learned over the years as being chief is trust your gut, right? Ultimately, folk are going to show you who they are. Take their word for it. If they're showing you who they are, believe them. Don't try to build your own version of who they are. Sometimes we don't want to see it, right? Because it may be a longtime friend. It may be, it may be somebody we've known for years, or somebody, we thought was X, but ultimately, as a chief officer, folk will show you who they are. Just trust your gut. Trust what got you to being a chief officer in the first place. All those years of making decisions on incident scenes, whether it's EMS related, hazmat, fire, you went with your gut. What's your gut telling you? Because your gut's built off of your years of training and experience. Don't shed all that because now you're in charge. You need to learn from it. But you need to develop other skill sets to go along with that. Because we can develop some bad habits out there. So the skill set changed, but I'll always give my gut about 80%, 80% leeway in decisions I'm making, just because, rarely has it proved me wrong.
Well, I think there's another critical element to that, and it's also because we, as you point out, a lot of times we'll work with people for several years, and then we are the ones that are in charge, and so you may have a personal relationship, but they're showing another side of you from a leadership perspective that you didn't know about. You have to be willing to have those courageous discussions, or just do the right thing. Even if it involves somebody that you've worked with for many, many years, but they're showing a side to you now that you didn't see before. And oftentimes I've seen many, many leaders just can't do that, and it gets them in trouble, ultimately gets them in trouble.
You know what? That's such a salient point to make. And there's a song out there that Tim McGraw sang, and it was basically based off the fact, the premise of the song was, I can't wait to get to that spot where everybody hates me, right? And it's about leadership. When you listen to it, it's about, a guy that's now, who was just one of the guys, one of the gang, one of the squad, one of the crew, until he's the boss, and now everybody hates him. And it's the premise of it is, I can't wait to get to that spot so everybody can hate me. And it's about moving up, but there's some truth in that, right? And it's like you said, growing up with folk in this business and in this industry, you build such close bonds because you all have similar goals and objectives. You're all trying to get as high in the organization as you can, but understanding that when in any organization, there's only one chief. So, at some point, there's gonna be a logical progression, and whether or not folk can deal with that is one side of that. But then, can you as an individual deal with the fact that they may not be able to deal with it? And you have to understand that you're going to lose friendships. You hear people tell you that it's lonely at the top, and you don't recognize that as a leader until sometimes you start to realize that your ride or dies out there, that they're not really anywhere to be found anymore, right? Because at some point it also becomes uncool to be seen socializing with the chief all the time, right? Because then that brings its own monikers and traditions of the fire service. So
and that plays out in every profession, by the way.
Every profession,
right? It's the same, just different titles.
Absolutely. But it all comes back to I've heard a couple sayings. As I've looked at how do I manage my organization and how do I manage my people and the things I do as a leader. And there was a couple courses that I was fortunate enough to go to, and one of them was taught by a gentleman by the name of Greg Gray, who does a lot with just leadership and, developing organizations and trying to teach you things from a different perspective. And during one of his courses, he made a comment that's always stuck with me. And that comment was, you have to understand that you're not going to be present for 90% of the staff meetings that happen in your organization. And I sat there for a minute, and then it dawned on me what he was talking about. And then, as you start looking at the resiliency lens and you start looking at the 21st century fire service, and you hear someone like, a Lee Cockerell tell you your organization isn't inclusive until your people say it is. So you take that and you combine those two statements or those two classes that happened 9 years apart from each other, and you're like, so am I as in tune with my people as I think I am? Or is our organization performing at the level that we think it is? So if all these conversations are happening that I'm not a part of, right, because it's my people talking, we have 14 fire stations. There's 14 staff meetings happening every morning at shift change.
Yeah.
That we're not a part of.
And you have 3 shifts.
Right. So look at all of all the water cooler conversations that go on, and we know how shift change is.
Oh yeah.
At the fire service, the problems of the world are all solved, between 6:30 and 7:30 every morning when we're changing shifts. So, it's everything is so simple at shift change, but you're not present for those conversations. So you're not hearing what the topic of that conversation is, and so if you're not asking your people, who's having 90% of the conversations, you're going to be left in the dark. And as a leader, that's not a good place to be, because you don't have the pulse of what's going on in your organization or what their expectations are. And that's a quick way to find yourself on the wrong side of your organization. So I think, that's so much of, you can start to see how all this just gets tied into the whole resiliency and sustainability models that so many communities are pushing now. It's not just about resources, right? It's about the human capital side of it and understanding your workforce, and being open and honest and willing is the key, right? You got to be willing to have these conversations, but you got to be open to what they're going to tell you as well.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Crucible podcast. If you have a story of adversity you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. Visit us at theleadershipcruciblepodcast.com and join us next time as we continue to explore how to live lives of success and significance.